What does it take for a city to accept an intruder, an object so tall, so metallic, so shocking that the people who claim to protect beauty call it monstrous? And then, a few decades later, cannot imagine their skyline without it. And what did it cost? In sweat, in risk, in public fury, in reputations placed on the line for that intruder to become the very shorthand for Paris itself. In the next 20 to 25 minutes, you will see how the Eiffel Tower was not simply built, but fought over, doubted, nearly erased, and then slowly transformed into a new kind of identity, one made of iron, wind, and modern ambition, until the question stopped being, why is it here? And became, how did we ever live without it? In the 1880s, Paris was already a capital of symbols. The city had its stone cathedrals and grand boulevards, its bridges and domes, its museums that spoke of empire and revolution. But the France of the Third Republic was also hungry to prove stability after political turbulence, hungry to show technological confidence, hungry to announce itself to the world not only as a guardian of art, but as a laboratory of progress. And the world had a stage for that hunger. The great international exhibitions, the world's fairs, where nations displayed their inventions like flags. For 1889, Paris planned something especially loaded. The year would mark 100 years since the French Revolution. The fair would not just be an event, it would be a statement. And statements demand a centerpiece. The challenge was bold to the point of arrogance. Imagine a tower of iron about 1,000 feet, around 300 meters, rising from the Champ de Mars. In an age when steel and iron were rewriting bridges and train stations, this was the ultimate dare. Not simply a tall building, but a structure that announced a new relationship between humans and gravity. A tower that said, we can calculate the wind, we can tame the curve, we can turn industrial technique into public spectacle. The plan, as later history would reveal, did not arrive as a single flash of genius from one man. It grew inside a company, through drafts and arguments and revisions. Two senior engineers, Maurice Koechlin and Émile Noguier, began shaping the core idea in 1884. Four latticework legs, wide at the base, narrowing as they rose, joined by trusses at regular intervals. It was engineering logic made visible. But logic alone does not win a city's heart. To make the structure more acceptable to public opinion, the architect Stephen Sylvester refined its appearance, introducing the great arches at the base and a more elegant silhouette that softened what could have looked like a bare industrial pylon. And hovering over all of this was Gustave Eiffel, the entrepreneur whose company could actually deliver the impossible, and whose name would, in time, become inseparable from the tower itself. Even at this early stage, the Eiffel Tower was never just metal and math. It was politics, money, and pride. A project of that scale needed more than a design. It needed a bargain. The tower would be built for the Exposition Universelle, but it would also need a business model to justify its cost and speed. Eiffel argued not only that it could be built, but that it could be financed in a way the state could accept, an arrangement tied to operating rights. In a city where every grand construction carried the weight of public scrutiny, this mattered. Because the moment the project moved from paper to ground, it would become a target. And then, in early 1887, the ground itself was opened. Foundations are where dreams become accountable. The first digging work began in January 1887. While future visitors would later glide up in elevators and call it effortless, the beginning was heavy, muddy, precise labor. The legs had to sit on foundations stable enough to carry the tower's weight and withstand wind forces that would constantly try to bend it. On the side closer to the Seine, the task was more complex, involving techniques that allowed work below water level. None of this would be visible in the finished monument, yet all of it would decide whether the tower was a triumph or a catastrophe. Above those foundations came the part that made Parisians stop and stare: the rising iron skeleton. In Eiffel's factory at Levallois-Perret, pieces were prepared with extreme precision, designed, calculated, and traced so accurately that parts could be assembled like an enormous, unforgiving puzzle. On the construction site, crews worked high above the city with steam cranes that climbed as the tower climbed. Wooden scaffolding filled the air like temporary forests. There was no digital modeling, no modern safety net of sensors and automated machinery. There were only measurements, procedures, and the human ability to repeat a task perfectly at height, in cold air, with wind that never truly rests. And the tower's true heartbeat was not the grand arches, not even the soaring lines. Toward the summit, it was the rivets. Millions of them. Each rivet was a tiny act of teamwork and timing. One man heating the rivet, another holding it in place, another shaping the head, another striking it with a sledgehammer. Hot metal, sparks, loud impacts, repeated again and again until the structure became a single locked lattice. The Eiffel Tower is often described as elegant, but elegance here was earned by brute discipline, by thousands of routine motions made exact. Official figures speak of roughly 18,038 metallic parts held by about 2.5 million rivets, assembled by hundreds of workers between the factory and the site. It was industrial choreography on a monumental scale. Yet while the tower was rising physically, a second tower was rising in the public imagination, made of fear, ridicule, and anger. Paris was the city of painters and poets, of salons and critics, of heritage carefully protected. A giant iron structure in the heart of the city did not look like progress to everyone. It looked like invasion. It looked like a factory chimney dressed up to dominate the skyline. And so the objections did not stay private. On February 14, 1887, as construction was beginning, a famous protest was published in the newspaper Le Temps. It was signed by major cultural figures, writers, composers, architects, people whose names carried weight. They framed the tower as an insult to Paris, warning that it would disfigure the city's beauty and identity. They did not argue softly. They argued as if the city itself were under threat. For them, the tower was not just ugly, it was a symbol of a world where engineering could overpower art, where money and spectacle could overwrite history. And this is where the story becomes sharper. The Eiffel Tower was born not into universal admiration, but into a public fight over what Paris should even be. So how did Eiffel answer? Not by pretending the anger didn't exist, but by reframing the question. He insisted that strength could contain its own hidden harmony, that the curves and structure calculated to resist wind would create their own beauty. In other words, he argued that the tower belonged to a modern aesthetic, one shaped by physics. He did not ask Paris to abandon beauty, he asked Paris to expand it. But arguments on paper were one thing. What mattered was the reality that kept rising day after day. As the tower grew, people who hated it still came to see it, sometimes to mock it, sometimes to measure it against their fears, sometimes simply because humans cannot resist the sight of something unprecedented. And that is the strange power of public works. They force attention. Even your enemies must look. By the time the tower reached its first level in 1888, it had already proven something important. It could stand. It was not collapsing under its own ambition. And the speed of construction became part of the myth. In a little over 2 years, the tower moved from excavation to completion, finished in March 1889. The schedule, the precision, the sheer logistics, these became a story of competence, a narrative that quietly undermined the idea that it was all reckless madness. Then came the moment every controversial monument secretly needs: the crowd. When the Exposition Universelle opened, visitors did what visitors always do: they searched for the thing no one else had. And the Eiffel Tower was that thing. It opened to the public in May 1889 and quickly drew people, not just because it was tall, but because it changed the relationship between the human body and the city. Paris had viewpoints, hills, towers, balconies, but nothing like this. To stand on the Eiffel Tower was to see Paris reorganized beneath you. Streets became lines. Buildings became patterns. The city became an object you could almost hold in your mind, like a map turned real. So here is the first transformation, from hated object to irresistible experience. Even if you called it ugly, you could not deny that it offered something no cathedral or palace offered: an entirely new way to look at the world. And once a structure gives people a new experience, it becomes harder to erase. Because you are no longer arguing about taste, you are arguing about loss. What would Paris lose if this vanished? But the story does not end with popularity. In fact, the tower's survival was never guaranteed. This is one of the most misunderstood truths about the Eiffel Tower. It was not built as an eternal monument. It was tied to a contract and a timetable. It was meant to stand for a limited period, about 20 years, and then, in principle, it could be removed. That idea sounds absurd now, precisely because the tower succeeded too well. But in the early years, success could fade. Visitor numbers could drop. New attractions could replace old wonders. A city that tolerated an eyesore for a fair might decide, later, that enough was enough. And that threat grew real. By the early 1900s, serious discussions about demolition. appeared. In 1903, demolition was strongly considered as the city looked at redeveloping the Champ de Mars and questioned the tower's long-term value. The tower had to justify itself again not as the star of 1889, but as a structure occupying precious urban space. So what saved it? This is where the Iron Giant reveals its second identity not as a tourist attraction, but as a tool. Eiffel himself pushed scientific experiments at the tower. Meteorological observations, aerodynamic work, tests of falling bodies, and, crucially, wireless telegraphy. The tower's height once attacked as arrogance became practical. Height is power in communication. Height extends range. Height turns the air into a pathway. With Eiffel support, Captain Gustave Ferry installed a military wireless telegraphy network at the tower in 1903, and suddenly the monument was not merely decorative, it was strategically useful. The tower's survival was no longer about whether artists liked it. It was about whether the state could afford to lose it. Think about the irony. The Eiffel Tower, accused of being useless, was defended by usefulness. The tower, mocked as a metal skeleton, became part of the nervous system of modern communication. It helped pull Paris into a new century where messages could travel through air rather than paper, where information could move faster than horses and trains. And once a structure becomes infrastructure, it gains a kind of protection that beauty alone cannot guarantee. This is the second transformation, from spectacle to necessity. And it did something even deeper. It shifted the meaning of identity. Paris had long defined itself through stone, monuments built to last, weighty with tradition. The Eiffel Tower suggested that identity could also be built from innovation, from experimentation, from a willingness to risk ridicule for a future that had not arrived yet. It was an identity made of openness, open latticework, open sky, open possibility. Over time, the tower's relationship with culture softened, then flipped. The very artists who feared it would ruin Paris slowly discovered that it could also frame Paris. It became a backdrop for photographs, for postcards, for films. It became a visual anchor. If you show the Eiffel Tower, you do not need to explain where you are. This is what symbols do, they compress meaning. And the tower's meaning kept expanding. Engineering achievement, modernity, romance, resilience, even defiance. A structure that began as an argument ended as a common language. Yet the tower never stopped being a machine. It continued to adapt. It carried antennas, supported broadcasting, and stayed relevant because it kept doing things. And even in the 21st century, it still changes in small ways that echo its original purpose: to stand above the city and interact with the air. In 2022, a new digital radio antenna increased its height to 330 meters, a reminder that the tower's top is not just a decorative point, but a working space tied to communication technology. So when people call it the Iron Lady, they often mean elegance. But the deeper truth is endurance. Iron endures by being maintained, repainted, reinforced, checked, and kept alive through constant care. The Eiffel Tower has survived because Paris decided again and again that it was worth the effort, worth the inconvenience, worth the contradictions. It survived early hatred. It survived the risk of becoming obsolete. It survived the temptation to clear space for something new. And each survival added a new layer to its identity. Now, step back and ask the question that brings the whole story into focus. Why did this particular structure succeed where so many bold projects fade into trivia? It succeeded because it never relied on a single reason. It was not only art, not only engineering, not only business, not only nationalism, not only tourism. It was all of them at once, shifting emphasis as decades demanded. When beauty was questioned, it offered strength. When usefulness was questioned, it offered science. When novelty faded, it offered meaning. And when the modern world needed signals in the air, it offered height. And perhaps that is how cities evolve. Not by preserving one fixed idea of themselves forever, but by absorbing the shocks that once seemed unacceptable until those shocks become familiar, then beloved, then indispensable. Paris did not lose its identity to the Eiffel Tower. Paris expanded its identity through the Eiffel Tower. The city learned to let iron stand beside stone, to let calculation stand beside poetry, to let the future cast a shadow across the past without erasing it. So the next time you see the tower in a photograph perfectly centered, sparkling at night, treated like it was always meant to be there, remember the uglier, more human beginning. The protests, the doubts, the workers striking hot rivets into place, the argument over what Paris should look like, the real possibility that the tower might be dismantled and forgotten. Remember that symbols are not born as symbols. They become symbols through conflict, through use, through time. If you stayed with me to the end, you now know the Eiffel Tower as more than a postcard. You know it as a gamble that reshaped a city's self-image, an iron giant that turned controversy into identity. If you enjoyed this kind of documentary storytelling, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more films like this, and tell me in the comments. What do you think truly saved the Eiffel Tower? Its engineering beauty, its scientific usefulness, or the way people emotionally adopted it over time?